Hello, a very, very warm welcome to the Know Your Cycle course and to this introduction. So I want to talk to you about hormones, how to chart your cycle, and also think, rather than just from a physiological point of view, also thinking about how we can use the analogy of the inner seasons for understanding different phases of our cycle. What you'll see on the webpage is also a PDF. It's quite a long PDF, including everything that I think would really help you to get going with charting. So do have a look at that, because it has lots of good information that will reinforce what I'm going to say here, and also some extra things about how you can be really creative with following your cycle. So let's dive in first of all with just knowing that it's normal to have a range in terms of people's length of cycles, in terms of how people experience their cycles. And we tend to have this idea that 28 days is the perfect length cycle, and that really just comes from the pill, hormonal contraception, and the way that they put the packets together with the pills was over a 20-day period. So actually people's periods can range from 25 even through to 35 days, and that can be quite normal. What's more interesting really is to chart your own cycle and know what is normal for you. And that might change over the years. So for example, before I had children, I had a regular cycle, it's 30 days. Post children, it moved to 28 days. And now as I come to the beginnings of perimenopause, it's quite normal that your cycles shorten a little bit before they start spacing out. So mine are currently 25 days. So over somebody's lifetime, what's normal length might change. Of course, some people don't have regular cycles, and we can talk about that as well. You can chart them in exactly the same way. They might differ from month to month, and that might actually begin to give you some clues as to why they're irregular. So I wanted to start just with a couple of diagrams. I did try to sort of sort these out sort of live as I was talking, but it was a bit tricky with the camera setup. So I hope you're going to be able to see this. So if we imagine this is a child, a female child, and as they come towards puberty, their estrogen starts to increase. And it might be all over the place to begin with. It might take them a while to actually get a first period. They might get the sort of mucus, the sort of white flow in their pants, in their knickers, for some time before any period shows up. They might get a little bit of spotting. And this phase can sort of take 10 years of fully coming through puberty. It's quite normal that the cycles are irregular for a while. They might take 2 years to settle down. Some people are regular right from day one. It varies, and then hopefully somebody gets into a regular pattern. It's a little bit more complicated than this. We'll see it in a moment. And of course, they might have times when there's pregnancy. Maybe they're breastfeeding for an extended amount of time when they don't have that same pattern. But then afterwards, hopefully, they go back to a regular pattern again. And then what we see here is the beginnings of perimenopause, and what often can happen is the estrogen can be higher than ever before. So it's not that when we come into the perimenopausal journey, it immediately starts declining. That comes later. It can be a lot higher. That can have implications for actually being quite fertile at that point. But then it can start. So I've drawn this a little bit sort of closer together because the periods can come more often, the cycles are shorter, and then they start to space out, and then eventually the estrogen's declining. And menopause is just one moment in time. It's when you've had a gap from your last period, haven't had a period for 1 year, or some people say it's safer to say 2 years since you've had a period is when you're officially in menopause. So I just wanted to give the overview of kind of a life cycle, because we've got these bookends of puberty and menopause, and we're focusing more on what's happening in the cycling years in this introduction. Another little simple diagram, but this is to talk about two of the main hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So we've got, with this line, estrogen peaking, and then the dotted line represents ovulation. It falls slightly, it actually comes back up again before dropping back down. So the beginning is day one of the period. It already starts to increase, getting helping eggs to start to mature here with the follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and it's peaking ovulation, and then it starts to decline. So this other one is progesterone, so that's involved in making the lining of the womb thicker in case there is conception, and then when there isn't conception, they drop away. And so this is the lowest point in terms of hormones, day one, and then it might be 25 days, it might be 28 days, it might be 35 days. This can vary from person to person. So that's a very, very simple look at the hormones, but it might be that you last looked at it in biology at school, and it's quite useful to have that sense of the physiology in the background. We're going to look at that more when we think about eating for the hormones, exercising for the hormones. We'll go into a bit more detail about how we can particularly support estrogen, how we can particularly support progesterone. But this natural cycling is really important. It can contribute to bone health, for example. So if somebody has been on hormonal contraception and they've been having, if you like, a fake cycle, you might have a breakthrough bleed, but it's not actually a natural period. You don't get the same pattern of hormones happening, and ovulating, the progesterone coming, all kind of contributes to our overall health. So what else is important to say at this stage? I think let's go straight on to charting, because that's where you begin to know what's normal for you. There are lots of different ways to do this. As I've said, do have a look at the PDF. You might not want to print out all of it, maybe just the key things that are relevant to you. It also looks at fertility awareness. So if that's particularly why you're doing this course, do have a look. There's a great book if you're having real issues with your period, very irregular, maybe you're having terrible bleeding, cramping, or maybe there's problems around ovulation, and that's where you have the most discomfort, then this book is really great. It's a very simple title, kind of clickbait title, Fix Your Period, but it has lots of fantastic information in. So it's by Nicole Jardine, and it's section by section. She goes through different scenarios, looks at nutrition, looks at supplements. It's a really good comprehensive guide. And of course, you know, you don't have to figure all these things out by yourself. Very often, the sort of complementary health professionals that are out there have more time to sit with somebody to really unpick what's happening with their cycle. So whether that's an acupuncturist or kinesiology can be really helpful for unpicking what's happening, maybe where you're lacking in certain nutrients. So rather than spending lots of money on supplements, you can actually know that you're targeting the right place. So let me share my screen to show you a chart that you can use. Oh, I've got a funny background. What's going on there? Okay, that's better. So this is a very simple chart. There's a wheel. Day one is the first day of your period. Sometimes it can be a bit tricky if you get a bit of spotting beforehand. That can be to do with lower progesterone levels. And you might think, oh, is it day one? Is it not day one? That might happen for a few days before. I would say when you actually fully start the period, so it might be heavier flow, it might be a feeling within yourself that you think, oh yeah, there can be that sense of relief going into the period as you let go of all that tension. That might not be the case if you're hoping to conceive, of course. It might be very different feelings. So day one is when the flow really gets going. And so we've got in red day 1 through to day 6. It will vary from person to person how long their period lasts, how heavy it is. And then we go through into the green section. This is pre-ovulation, so it's the rest of the follicular half of the cycle where the eggs are getting more mature. And then we switch over into the blue, which is representing sort of post-ovulation, the sort of summer phase. And then last part is the autumn, which is premenstruum, leading up to the period. So you might not fill in all of those days. If you're beyond 30 days, then you might need to turn over and write on the back of the sheet. But you can print this off and you can use it in different ways. So you could simply, if you're interested in physical symptoms, you could write down what you're feeling. Maybe you're noticing that white flow, the cervical mucus that you just find in your knickers. Maybe you're noticing tenderness in the breasts. Maybe you note down tiredness and energy levels through the cycle. Or it might be that you're very intrigued about the sort of emotional changes you have, or even how your behaviour changes over the whole cycle, and then you note down just a few words. So you could do it, you know, if you're new to this, it could just be 3 words to kind of sum up your day and how you think the cycle relates to that. And as you go back over the months, you'll begin to notice patterns. Of course, there are apps. So a really popular one that people have come to the course to use is Clue. There are different ones out there. You can also get journals. There's lots of really lovely journals. So here's one. If I stop sharing, I'll show you better. So Wild Wisdom Journal. It gives you space to write each day and helps you have space to set intentions for the month. So it's a little bit more involved. You can see where the moon corresponds with where you are in your cycle. So that can be another nice way of doing it. And most recently, I've been using this one, the Daily Perimenopause Diary. And I'll show you in a moment where you can find that, and also their version for the menstrual cycle if you're not that far along. So if you're more interested in just sort of ticking the boxes to note symptoms, rather than sort of writing words around emotions and things, this might be for you. It's particularly good if you are concerned about something about your cycle, or maybe you're heading into perimenopause and you think you might want to speak to a GP about it at some point. This is like collecting data. So you can take it in and say, look, on all these days, this has been happening and it's been quite severe, and it gives you something solid to work with. So at the top, it starts with talking about how many tampons you're using, or a cup, or pads, and it gives you instructions about how you quantify that. And then it has lots of symptoms down the side, so things like the amount of flow, cramps, soreness in the breast, fluid retention. In the perimenopause one, it talks about hot flashes, night sweats. That isn't in the menstrual cycle one. Sleep problems. And it also has room for supplements, so you can track whether you think supplements are helping or not. So let me show you the website where that comes from. I'm going to share my screen again. Just need to make sure I've got the right page up. Okay. So this is in Canada, this centre, and they've done a lot of work around cycles and particularly progesterone and the role of progesterone in the menopause. So here you can see, if you could just click on these. So it's called CEMCOR, CEMCOR is the name of the centre. And if you go on their website, you can click through to the menstrual cycle diary and print it off, or the perimenopause diary if you're a bit further along and want to track different kinds of symptoms. So it's free, you can just access that. I'm mentioning it in a bit more detail because it's on the guide, the PDF, because it's something that I found more recently. Lots of information on there, so do have a browse while you're there. But it's very, very powerful to be able to collect this data. I find it easiest if it's on paper, because then it's easy to kind of flick back and look over the months for me. I've been known to highlight things, and then you can see whether this is a pattern that happens every month. Was it just a blip? You know, but if you're more interested in sort of the emotional side, we're going to come in a little bit to the inner seasons and how you can use that as a map for understanding the different phases and how you can work with it. But I wanted to mention, if you do have a very irregular cycle, maybe you don't have any periods at all, then using a lunar calendar, a moon calendar, is very helpful. So again, things like this one, you can search for moon calendars, and you would use the new moon. So the day of the new moon would be your day one, just to give you a kind of anchor point. And then as you move through the month with the moon, it gives you a structure. So it can also be used postmenopausally once somebody doesn't have a cycle anymore. But otherwise, you just can feel, and this is the feedback I've had from people on workshops, that if you don't have a regular cycle, you can feel a bit adrift and you don't know where to start charting. It's very normal that in the sort of ovulation time that you might be really busy, you've got lots of energy, you're doing lots of things out in the world, and you just completely forget to write in, or however you're charting your cycle. When you realise that, just carry on, pick up. You might be able to remember the last couple of days, you can fill it in retrospectively, but just pick up again, rather than think, oh, I've messed it up, and wait till the next cycle. So, I think let's talk a little bit about the inner seasons. This is something that was talked about in this book, World Power, by Alexandra Pope and Shani Hugo Wurlitzer. I've done quite a lot of training with them, and compared to the book I showed you before, which is very sort of thinking about the physiology, thinking about how to affect the hormones through diet and exercise and supplements, this book is much more around the mental aspect, the psychological aspect of your cycle, and even the spiritual aspect of it. They very much see the cycle as having a lot to teach us. We can learn a lot from tracking our cycle, and they say it's like a hamster wheel. We go round and around, and we really pay attention. It can help us at points in our life like pregnancy and birth, or through the menopausal journey, or even death. That if we know how to handle ourselves through the ups and downs of the cycle, it really helps us in other situations as well. There's lots of lovely quotations in here. You might even see a few quotations from me about our experiences. So the idea is that we use the analogy of the inner seasons to give us a tool for navigating where we are. So I'll show you a diagram in a moment, but the inner winter represents the period. So day one of the cycle, we're into winter. as we go into the pre-ovulation, so we're still in the follicular phase, the egg ripening, that is the inner spring. And we come to ovulation, that takes us into inner summer, and then inner autumn is the premenstruum, and we go back to where we started, inner winter. So it can give us a shorthand to talk about what's going on. And in my women's circle, where it started out as a red tent, and we would always start the circle with saying where we were in our cycle, if you had a cycle, or you could say where you were according to the lunar cycle otherwise. And it's like a shorthand. So if I said, oh, I'm day 19, the people in the circle would get to know what that meant for me. That meant I was coming into the next phase. It was kind of a crossover between one season and another. And for me, if I'd managed to pace myself all the way through the month and all the way through the cycle, rather than getting too busy, then that would be fine. I might not even notice that transition. But if I had been too busy and saying yes to too many things, that drop in estrogen would affect me, and I'd feel like, oh gosh, I've fallen off a cliff. Why did I say yes to so many things? It's overwhelming. It's too much to handle. And there'd be a sort of crash emotionally. So it helps you begin to make sense of what you're feeling or behaviour that you're seeing. It's very common in premenstruum that people can become more sensitive. So for me personally, it's a sensitivity to noise. So normally the rest of the cycle I might be fine, and the radio's on, children come in asking questions, husband gets home from work, lots of people wanting my attention. In that premenstruum though, that would be overwhelming, and I'd just not put the radio on and say, look, just slow down one at a time, and it's too much. And I tend not to watch the news. I know it'll be too overwhelming in that phase. For other people, I know some of them, it's smell. Suddenly they're very sensitive to smell in that phase. Or other people's spatial awareness goes a bit, and they might be able to parallel park beautifully the rest of the month, and it comes to that week before the period and it's gone out the window, and they just cannot connect in the same way. So our hormones, although they're there in very minute amounts, can affect us massively. And that just reminds me that although on this picture I've sort of shown them being at the same level, the concentration is quite different between estrogen and progesterone. So that's a simplification to kind of help us understand. And it becomes more important, this dip in between, if we're thinking about things like intermittent fasting. That dip, we need to sort of work a little bit differently with what we're eating. Also maybe with training or exercise, we might treat those days a little bit differently, which is why I wanted to show them. So let me just share a picture to show you. Can I make it bigger? Okay. So we can layer other parts of life on top of this idea. So we've got, if you look at the top, we've got summer. So if we imagine that as the outer summer, the season that we experience in the UK, it might be other parts of the world that don't have the same seasons. They might have high summer or wet season, dry season. But we've got an outer summer, and we can think of this inner summer of ovulation. But we can also connect it to other things. So we can connect it to the full moon. So if you're charting with the lunar cycle, that's kind of like your ovulation, the high energy. It also connects in terms of 24 hours and circadian rhythms with midday. And we've also got there, where you are in your life cycle, got the mother. So it might not be mother of children, it might be sort of mothering your career. You're really at that point of manifesting things in the world. If we go around to autumn on the right, we've got the autumn, whether it's inner or outer, connecting with the waning moon. It connects with the afternoon. and it connects with the menopausal stage of life. And then we have the new moon, and inner winter, outer winter. So that's the menstruation phase. Day one of the winter would be day one of the period. And that connects with midnight. So that lack of light on the new moon, that quiet time at night. And it also connects with the elder stage of life. So the wise woman. And then coming around to spring, so inner spring and outer spring, connects with the waxing moon. So for some people, that's going to feel like a sort of increase of energy. It connects with the morning time and with the maiden in the life stages. So it can be nice to connect through these different parts, because sometimes if there's an issue sort of emotionally, we find that the problem is not in the season itself, but its opposite. So for example, if we're having a real issue with the inner autumn, with the premenstruum, it might be that there's something happening across in the inner spring. It might be that we have a very critical voice, an unkind voice internally that is quite negative towards yourself or to other people. And it might be because you don't have any time in the month to be playful, to have some time just to do fun things. And so by the time you get to the premenstruum and your hormones are changing and they might start to be dropping and you've got less energy, you're feeling irritated, you're feeling a bit fed up by this and frustrated, and it starts to come out, either to yourself or to others, this irritability. And then where the cross is, we can think of these crossovers from one season to another, or from one part of the moon to another part of the moon, as being important. So I was giving the example before of day 19 was a crossover for me when I had a longer cycle. And if I hadn't looked after myself for a whole month, that crossover would be really difficult. I feel a real shift and notice that I haven't seen that self-care. So if you're very new to charting, don't worry about the crossovers. That might be too much to think about at the moment. But just do notice when you're charting, you might have a particular day that is harder, or that actually you felt braver, whatever it is, whether you kind of conceive it as positive or negative. Just paying attention and writing those things down, over time you might begin to see a pattern. Something else that I wanted to mention that they talk about in this book is the via positiva and the via negativa, because I think that's a really useful concept. The only thing with the labels that they've chosen is that positiva and negativa sounds like a positive thing and a negative thing. What they were talking about is that first half of the cycle, from inner winter into inner spring, can be this via positiva, returning. Well, actually, let's do it from inner spring, inner summer. So we've got this very outward looking, energy is increasing, we might be busier, social, out in the world. And then once we get into the inner autumn and the inner winter, they call that the via negativa, and it's more a sort of turning inwards. And I guess in our society, that being more internal, feeling a bit more sensitive might be viewed negatively, but they don't mean it at all in that way, because actually a lot of people that attend their workshops and their retreats are sensitive people, they're empaths, and actually that can feel like a really lovely part of the cycle where you're very much in tune with what's going on inside of you, with your inner world. Whereas when the attention gets pulled outwards, that can feel like a more difficult time. And this leads to something really important to say. Very often in circles, in workshops, I ask people to share what is their most favourite season, their external season that they really love. And then applying it as an inner season, which part do they like? Which part do they not like? And you might think if you love summer, you know, because you're outside and the days are longer, and for yourself with your inner summer, you might feel more sociable, you might feel sexier, and you think, wow, this is great. Surely everybody's the same. For some people, that's just too much. They prefer that inner autumn, the inner winter, and that more inward looking phase. So there's great variety. It's good to know for yourself, you know, what feels comfortable to you. Where is the place where you feel very comfortable, where you can breeze a little bit through that part of the cycle? And which part is the bit where you find it a little bit trickier or really hard? For some people, it could be really hard. So I just want to acknowledge the variation that's there. And like I said, with my cycle, it's changed over the years that I've been charting. Your favourite can change. I would have said when I first started all of this work that the inner summer was my favourite. Lots of energy. And then a while ago, I would have said it was my inner winter, because I really appreciated the chance that I could slow down, give myself permission to rest when I had my period. I really enjoyed relaxing into that. But I think it's moved again. So this is not something that we might do for 6 months and then we've learned everything that we have to learn. It's a beautiful practice to take you through your life. And there might be times when you just keep a very simple chart, just touching base. And there might be times when something's going on where you keep much more detailed charts, whether that's kind of ticking symptoms or whether it's writing lots of things about what's going on for you. So a little bit more about the inner seasons, in case that's the part you're really interested in. So like anything else, what I'm going to share with you is an archetype. It might be different for you, and that's the reason why we chart and see what's happening for each person. But as a general rule, if you work on the basis of a 28-day cycle, we're going to give 7 days to each of the inner seasons. So in a winter, it's going to be day 1. That lasts for 7 days. In a spring, then follows on for about 7 days. In autumn, the next 7 days, or summer, and then autumn. But it might vary for you. It might depend how long your cycle is. If you have a very short cycle, you might feel like you have hardly any time in summer at all before it whips back round to your period. So what I'm giving you is an archetype. For many people, let's start with the inner spring. The inner spring can be a time of increasing energy, just like we see outside in the outer spring, with flowers starting to appear, leaves starting to appear. We connected it before to the waxing moon. There's just more light in the night sky. So it can be a time of increasing energy. And with this, if you think about the connection with the life stage of being a youth or a maiden, it's a time of exploration. It can be a playful time using your imagination. So it's very much about new ideas. It's about trying not to be judgmental about those ideas. You know, if maybe you're coming up with ideas for something, and if you too soon go, oh no, that's silly, that could never happen, you're not giving them chance to grow and bloom. So in terms of self-care, it's really important to think about putting some fun in your month, in your cycle. What do you do just for fun? Not to have a particular outcome at the end, not for a certain agenda, but just to have some time off from being an adult. And then moving through into the inner summer, this is kind of the peak of energy for some people, connecting with that ovulation. There's the estrogen peaking, there's more testosterone. Women have testosterone as well, just in smaller amounts. So with strength training, that's where you can really lift heavier weights. But it might be for you that it's about, okay, you've got the energy now to get that project finished. Or you've got energy to stay out a little bit later than you would normally. You've got the energy to socialize and be out there in the world. So it's this feeling of being out, maybe sharing your passions with people, you might feel a bit more confident at that stage because of the effects of the estrogen. And there have been studies showing that pole dancers get higher tips around ovulation. And it's the estrogen actually having an effect on how they look, how they behave, the pheromones that they give off. Coming into autumn, there's a real shift. So I was talking before about the sort of more internal. And this is where, if you think of the premenstruum, that irritability can come, feelings of frustration, overwhelm. But I think it's really important to note that often with that voice, there can be kernels of truth. So it's to listen to them, but not become overwhelmed by these voices. So if you're somebody who journals, you might journal what's coming up and that unkind voice, but then trying to contain it rather than let it take over, and leave it until you're another part of your cycle where you can see it a little bit more objectively and go, well, actually that part is true. It also means that if it's about somebody else, you can maybe talk about it and communicate about it in a kinder way, in a way that can be heard rather than that shouty way in autumn. So there's an element of discernment and being the truth speaker in that part that can be really useful. But it's always sometimes waiting and processing it before you actually act on it. So there's that turning in, it might be more reflective. It's a good time for the real nitty-gritty of a project. So where, I'll talk a moment about the creativity cycle. But yeah, it's the nitty-gritty. That might be where you kind of like, yeah, I'm going to do my tax return, or I'm going to, sit down and pay the bills and get things in order. And then the inner winter, again, is even more internal. So it's that chance to pause, which can be really hard in our culture, and have a chance to reflect, have a chance to recharge. So it can feel quite difficult if you're not used to doing that. You feel like you're kind of going against society, where you're told you're meant to go 24/7 all the time. But in some cultures, this was the time of visioning. This is when you would go away from your everyday activities. That's where the red tent comes from. And you would have a chance to think about the bigger picture. So that's just very, very, very brief overview of the different kind of qualities. And if that sounds really intriguing, I would send you to their book. It's also as an audio book, and they go into much more detail about sort of the difficulties of the different phases, the tasks of the phases, but also the gifts of each phase. And so if we think about in terms of creativity, you can see that that inner spring energy lends itself to new ideas, to dreaming big. We come into the inner summer, that's where we can really put some work in, to put things down in paper so that we can share ideas with somebody else or begin to make things. We come through into the inner autumn, that's more about discerning, like, okay, well, it seemed like a good idea, but actually I need to go off in this direction, or there are lots of great ideas, I can't do all of them, so how am I going to prioritize? Or it might be, you've done some writing in the inner summer, and this is where you're editing and really trying to hone it. And then the inner winter is that part where you put it aside for a few days and you step back and you reassess, and then in the spring you come back with it with fresh eyes. So it might be on a project, it's not just one cycle, but you might go round a few times. And particularly with big decisions in life, that can be very useful to go through a whole cycle and see it from different perspectives. So I hope that sort of intrigued you and made you want to know more. Keep going back to the charting, begin to see what your patterns are, because although they're the archetypal way of looking at the seasons, you might be different. I would love to hear your questions, so do feel free to email me, or if you're doing this during June, we're going to have a group where you can put your questions in there and share experiences. So let me know, do you want more information about the sort of physiology side of things. Come back to that with the live talks, which are looking at eating, how to eat for your hormones, how to exercise for your hormones. Or perhaps you'd like to dive more into the different phases and how that can begin to help you understand yourself better. I really, really, truly believe that the cycle is like a barometer. So like you have for the weather, pressure and things like that. It gives you a sense of wellness in the whole of you. So whether that's mental wellness or physical wellness. So, you know, it could be that somebody, oh, well, my periods have disappeared and oh, that's a relief. But usually if we are in a really healthy state, we would have a regular period. That shows that our body feels like we've got enough resources to be able to have a period. Girls tend to only get their period once they've got 20% body fat, because you need a certain kind of body composition to be able to produce a period. I wanted to mention a couple of additional things that you might find interesting. So I made this a while ago, Colour Your Cycle. It's a colouring book full of inner season mandalas. So it has different mandalas. So in a winter, this one's about honouring your cycle, and there's something you can colour in while you reflect. And then there's also stories and sort of experiences and insights. So again, get you to reflect and maybe deepen your own understanding of your own cycle. So that's something that you could order directly from me, or you can actually get individual mandalas if you're particularly attracted to one through my Etsy shop. So if you search for a Brilliant Birth on Etsy, it'll come up and you'll be able to kind of browse through them. If you have a younger person in your house, maybe you have a daughter who is approaching puberty or just going through getting her period, Ruby Luna's Moontime is a book. It's in a diary format that I wrote for 10 to 12-year-olds, or maybe 9, even 8 if they're changing quite early, to introduce them to lots of ideas of period products. It's got sort of a bit of history and environment, but in a really, really fun way. So that's a bit of an introduction. Just checking if there's other things that I wanted to talk about. I really think the charting is the foundation for getting to know your cycle. It might be that you know you're just busy all the time, and you signed up because you thought, I need to put into place some movement to help my cycle, some relaxation to help my cycle, and those practices are there. You'll really notice whether those practices are helping if you're charting, if you notice that there's a shift in the emotions or if there's a shift in your symptoms. So it can be very easy to think, oh, I'll remember, oh God, that was a terrible cramp, how could I possibly forget that? But as the months pass, it's very hard to keep the detail of, you know, exactly how long, or did you have to take a paracetamol? So I would really encourage you, even if it's a few ticks on a sheet, to get into the habit of that. You'll really learn a lot about yourself that way. Okay. So do let me know your questions, and I want to be able to respond to those. You can, you know, get really interested in the physiological side and the nitty-gritty of the hormones, or it might be that you stay on the emotional side, or a mixture of both. But I want it to be a really wonderful journey where you can be curious, and for some of you might think, how did I not know some of this sort of basic stuff a long time ago when I started my periods? For others of you, you might have been charting for some reason for a while, and I want to be able to take you deeper into that journey. So let me know what would be most helpful. week by week, there'll be different talks that are recorded that hopefully will give you further and further insight. But I want to thank you for taking this interest. I think if everybody had more cyclical awareness in their life, really noticing the seasons outside, then that might change the way we live in the world to a more sustainable way. So that's it from me for the moment, and I look forward to being in connection with you very soon.